Welcome back, David Quigley again. Today we're going to be talking about forgiveness. Forgiveness is a wonderful thing. Everybody loves forgiveness. I have a friend, for example, says, well, whatever the problem is, forgiveness is going to be the solution. Just be sure to forgive everybody, forgive yourself, forgive your perpetrators, forgive them all. And there's nothing wrong with that. Forgiveness is a very, very wonderful medicine. But it's a medicine that is often misused and misunderstood. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about what real forgiveness is and how important it is that we do it right. I'd like to speak of 3 levels of forgiveness. The first of these levels of forgiveness is when we simply make the decision, well, I'm going to forgive. That asshole probably didn't know what he was doing. My father probably did the best he could, beating up his kids. And so I guess I'm going to forgive because he didn't know any better. And it's up to me to forgive. And Jesus says to forgive. And so I'm going to forgive. Well, that's a decision that we make. Forgiveness as a decision happens up here in our heads. It happens up in perhaps even in our prefrontal lobes of the cerebral cortex, where our social instincts are carefully developed. So forgiveness is a way, in the sense of shutting down the rage and the desire for vengeance and replacing it with a layer of, well, I forgive. Damn it, but I forgive. While it doesn't help the body very much, that's the problem with that kind of forgiveness, because the body is still locked up in that turmoil that is unresolved when our forgiveness is merely mental. A typical example would be the client that says, yeah, I forgive my father. I forgived him for years and years and years, which of course is why I've got all these problems with my TMJ and my teeth and falling apart, but that's all right. I forgive my father. Obviously, your dedication to forgiving your father includes some very expensive dental bills. But this is a typical example of how many of us use the idea or the decision to forgive, and as a result, lock a lot of anger and pain in our own bodies. Well, there's a deeper level of forgiveness I'd like to recommend, which is the forgiveness that comes when we have completed our communication with those who have hurt or betrayed us. And we've listened to their response on the spiritual planes. That type of forgiveness is much deeper. It's an ecstasy that happens in your entire body when you feel that kind of forgiveness. For example, when I was in my 20s, I had written a song about the tragedy of my childhood and lack of love there. And I was going to play this song for my father in the hopes that maybe we could arrive at some kind of forgiveness for the abuse I had endured. So as I played this song for my father, you see, unfortunately, I didn't get no forgiveness happening. My father, who had always had problems with his temper, became outraged and began his face turning purple with rage, his eyes popping out of their sockets. I'm lucky he didn't slap me. He started screaming, how dare you say that our family didn't have any love in it? How dare you? Our family always had love. We had lots of love. My mother, attempting to intervene, said, no, Richard, there's never been any love in our family. And then he just began screaming at her. Well, at this point, of course, I could have laid on a little shellac of forgiveness there and said, well, I guess I forgive you, Dad, because you don't understand and you never will, and I guess I've got to move on. But I'm not attached to mental forgiveness myself. I don't do much with intellectual forgiveness. Instead, I got in touch with my rage. I realized, okay, he's not willing to hear me. He's not willing to listen. So I did another process with him. I got away from him physically at that point. He was too toxic. But about a year later, I remember very distinctly when my father and I were having a conversation on the phone, and he said, you're working hypnosis? Well, the law is going to catch up with you. He was convinced I was doing something illegal, although hypnosis has been a legal profession for many years. He was convinced I was doing something illegal and evil, and it wasn't Christian. That was the worst thing. But instead of shellacking on the forgiveness or just settling for the ongoing rage that I had felt for many years, I decided to process my rage with him. I took out a pillow and I beat it and I said, "How dare you? How could you say that? I'm doing something important for the world. Why can't you see it? Why can't you love me? Why can't you forgive me for not becoming a minister like you wanted? I can't be a minister. I've got to do this." I screamed and I hit and I beat. I kicked. And the interesting part of that is that when it was over, I listened to my father's response. And I heard his words for the first time. I heard in the spirit, I did not hear it in the physical plane, but in the spirit world, I heard his voice, "Son, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I made mistakes with you. I'm sorry I don't understand the nature of your work. I wish I could understand." Now, my father had never apologized to me in his entire career as my father. To hear those words of apology and to admit that he'd made mistakes in my childhood was so unlike him, and yet I felt in my heart that it was true. I felt his voice coming to me on the spiritual planes and saying, "I'm sorry. I want to understand your work." And my heart just melted with forgiveness. It was the beginning of one of the best friendships of my whole life, the one that I share to this day with my beloved Father. At this point, I could reach what I call deep forgiveness, body forgiveness, because I had expressed my rage, I had heard his apology, and his commitment to better, to do it better. 3 days later, I get a letter. This is before email. I get a letter saying, "Son, I'm so sorry. I made mistakes with you. I want to do it better. I want to understand your work." That's what he did. And I saw the letter, a real letter from him, validating the spirit communication we had had. And I felt an even deeper tears of forgiveness. We've gone on to become very close friends over the years. The important thing about this type of forgiveness, deep forgiveness, is that it requires that we express our rage and our hurt, that we tell the other person what they've done to us and how it felt and what the consequences were. And then we listen. You might even have to shake a pillow or beat someone with a bat or even send them to hell in the inner world if we're really pissed off, if they really did some terrible things. But then we listen to their response. And sooner or later, we find out what really happened. I learned from my father that as a Christian minister, he was convinced that if I wasn't in the church and if I didn't follow the guidelines of the church, that the world was going to go to hell in a handbasket. And he was convinced that without the guidance of Jesus and of the church, that all humanity was going to be lost. And at that point, I gained a much deeper understanding in my father's mental attitudes and feelings. And frankly, there's a lot of truth to what my father said. There's a great deal of evil in the world today, and unfortunately, Christians, in my experience, aren't doing much about that. But my father was. And my father wanted me to join the church and be a part of the solution. I finally, with my heart, understood how important the church and Jesus and God was to him. Maybe that's why I'm a Christian today. Who knows? But the truth is, I'm also a Buddhist. I'm also a Taoist. I'm also a Native American. I do it all. But this was a great realization that when I could experience deep forgiveness with my Father, and it begins with telling the truth. Jesus says the truth will set you free. And I had to start not with, "Okay, Dad, I forgive you." It had to start with, "I'm pissed off at you." And by dialoguing and expressing the rage, the hurt, the anger, we finally get to the renewal of our friendship. Now, there's still a third layer of forgiveness I'd like to explore, and that's what I call radical forgiveness. Radical forgiveness, a term developed by Colin Tipping, and there's even a book he wrote. Radical forgiveness is different because radical forgiveness is about you were actually doing the job I hired you to do, so there's nothing to forgive here. In fact, you did a good job of it. I discovered radical forgiveness in a rather peculiar way. One of my inner guides, Michaela, my inner guardian angel, she said, David, would you like to know, I just finished having a visit with my parents, and would you like to know, she said, why your father bugs you all the time about being a minister? Why he doesn't seem to be getting you? Yes, I'd like to know. It turns out in the 12th century A.D., my father and I had been brothers who loved each other very much, deeply devoted to each other. And I've always felt that I had a deep connection to my father. Well, here I see that we were brothers working on a farm in northern Spain. And, well, I decided to take holy orders. I decided to become a monk and become a Christian and a monk and live a celibate life and somehow get to heaven. Faster than him, of course. Because my father chose to join the military and farm the land and do the usual things that young poor nobles did back in those days. And I was convinced that it was evil, and I tried to make him change his ways. I said, you need to join the church, you need to join the monastery, don't get married to that woman, become a celibate monk like me, that's the only way to be saved. I turned out to be a great vice abbot of that monastery. But I sure hurt my father. I sure destroyed that friendship. And in this lifetime, my father was here to show me exactly how that feels. He was here to show me exactly how wrong that was. And he did an extremely good job. So when I reached radical forgiveness, I realized that there was, in fact, nothing to forgive. But indeed, it was time to give him my gratitude and congratulations for the excellent job he had done in teaching me just how obnoxious being a religious fanatic can be. Thank you, Richard Jackson, for being one of the greatest teachers of my life. So we see in summary that there are actually three kinds of forgiveness, all of which have their value. The first, mental forgiveness, is when we aren't ready maybe to do the in-depth processing required, but we certainly want to get off the revenge shtick. So we just make an announcement, make a decision, lay a little layer of lacquer on top of our feelings to say, "Oh, Loretta, I forgive." It's certainly better than taking revenge or being obsessed for one's entire life about revenge, but it is only the first step. And what I'd recommend is going to a good therapist that can assist you in spirit communication so you can release all the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, the loneliness from your body, from your feelings by using spiritual communication. Here's why I can't forgive you, you jerk. And then listening to their response. And then oftentimes weeping with the realization that they were doing the best they could. Maybe that they had no idea how much it was going to hurt you. And then when we see their remorse, their grief, then we reach the second layer of forgiveness, deep forgiveness, body forgiveness, another name I have for body forgiveness. But we can only discover the importance and the value of radical forgiveness, usually, when we can examine the karmic history across many lives. And we can examine the preconception contract in which we see where we've set up these patterns of suffering, these patterns of abuse, in order to learn the lessons of history. And we choose perpetrators like my father, because they're friends, to do these wonderful things for us. And so instead of being angry now, we can simply be grateful. Thank you for giving me the service I hired you to deliver. These are the three levels of forgiveness. Good luck in exploring them for yourself.